Hey everyone, my name is Ashoka. I'm the founder and CEO of Orchestra Bio, a software platform for helping biotech companies manage their drug development programs. We're interviewing people who help navigate the journey from discovery to medicine. And today I have Janelle. Janelle, before starting us off, tell us a little bit about yourself and your career journey in the life sciences industry. Tell us where it all began.
Yeah, absolutely. So, ever since I was a kid, just love of the natural world and excited about what I see out in nature, the animals, looking up at the stars, and that led me to pursue a degree in cell molecular biology. So I started my career at the lab bench, and I really enjoyed the science. I loved the hands-on aspect, but what I quickly realized is that I was more results-driven than wanting to know all the nuances of the science itself. And so I kind of transitioned then into more operational focus opportunities. So I had the unique fortune of being involved in a day one startup early in my career, transitioning out of Maxigen Inc. into Ultravax as a 6-person team going into incubator space and just basically building something from nothing, and really sparked my interest and my passion for day one startups. So from there, I kind of transitioned to kind of like traditional operations management, thinking about how do we move out of an incubator into our own independent space? How do we transition from government grant funding to a revenue-focused model?
Mm-hmm.
And over time, I just got more in depth in business operations, co-founded Maxigen LLC as performing research services for industry partners. And then in my last opportunity, I was the vice president of operations at Mesa Vaccines, joining the two founders pre-Series A to basically build an infrastructure around their technology. How do we tackle these aggressive timelines for our clinical development plan, building from the ground up? So, in the infrastructure, that includes the team, the people, the physical space, systems, processes. How do we convince people to join our team?
Mm-hmm. And so it's super interesting. So you started kind of very, very early on with a kind of deep interest in biology. Then you kind of took you to studying molecular and cell biology, and you were on a hands-on bench role. And then you kind of, through fortune or twist of fate, kind of found yourself into the startup world, right? And it sounds like you've also then worked at startups from like the earliest stages also to how they scale. So there's a lot to dig into in there. But maybe the first question is, a lot of people aspire to transition from the bench to roles in operations and portfolio and program management, but that role necessarily isn't widely understood. So maybe just from your own kind of intrinsic interest, like what sparked that transition for you, and what were some of the key moments that led you from a more classic role at the bench to a more management and operations type role, and what's some of the advice that you would give for people who are interested in those kinds of roles?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the key reasons I was able to do what I did was because I was in a startup environment. When you're in a small team, you're exposed to all different aspects of a company, all the different departments. Also being with a group of scientists, there was no business people, there was no operations. Everybody chipped in. And I was really fortunate to have mentors that gave me the space and opportunity to try new things outside the lab bench. And I think really what started it for me was we were in the incubator space. We had luckily brought a lot of our own equipment, but basically, it was unorganized, right? People were buying supplies we already had because there's no organization in the lab. There's no procurement system. Everybody was using individual accounts instead of leveraging discounted business accounts. There was no process for decision-making and prioritization. We were doing amazing science, but it was inefficient. And time is money, right? And especially when you're in an early stage startup, you have very lean operations. And so it's really about being purposeful. And so basically, I was doing a dengue project, making recombinant DNA libraries. And I went to the CSO and was like, hey, do you mind if I carve out some of my time to think about improving efficiencies? And so I kind of started off with procurement because it's a pretty easy way to save money. From there, just better organization. And then I think the really kicker that made me be like, this is what I want to do is the incubator we were at Ultravax gave us a 2-week notice of moving because actually LinkedIn had bought the plot and was going to tear it down.
Oh, wow.
This is years ago, like a decade ago. And for me, that didn't seem like that was the only answer. I didn't feel comfortable with this long down time if we moved into a new space, if we stayed with that incubator. And so I went down to City Hall in Sunnyvale and I said, what does it take to run a research lab in this city?
Wow.
And the incubator was like, oh, it's difficult. The permitting's difficult. You can't do it, right? Turns out it's very manageable to run your own biotech company in your own lab. But you have to ask a lot of questions. So I met with building inspectors, hazardous materials inspectors. I started reaching out to vendors that we were working with, like in waste management, and just saying, what do I need to do? And I was fortunate across the street, we found a 5,000 square foot facility that had a BSL-2 lab already built. And yeah, I just had to piece it together and figure out all the permitting at the county, state, and federal level, and figured out how to set up everything. So it's just that was the first time was extremely painful.
Yeah.
And I've done it multiple times now, and basically that just triggered my passion of, I want to see the science get to market. And I've seen amazing companies fail with, had amazing science, but they just weren't utilizing their resources properly,
Right,
and weren't collaborating properly. So I think that was really my main goal, and then transitioned into the business side to just take it to the next level.
Yeah. And that's a pretty incredible story. So, I think maybe some takeaways from that is, first, you were working as a scientist and saw kind of just in the day-to-day work of the company opportunities for efficiencies in terms of procurement and so on. But then a kind of crisis showed up to the company, which was, hey, we're going to get kicked out of our lab space in 2 weeks. And you took it upon yourself to go figure out, how do we, build a lab space, find a lab space, from the government side to the facilities and everything in between. And that kind of threw you into the kind of role almost by interest, but also by necessity.
Yeah.
So, I'm curious, you've had other experiences since then. Sometimes a crisis shows up, but, not all companies feel that this kind of philosophy and operating model is relevant for them because it's too early and everything's, it's too early in the company's journey. We don't need to have processes and procedures in place. We don't even know if this is going to work. So I'm curious, what have you seen both in your early experiences and later experiences of, what are the differences in what is relevant or applicable in terms of operations and operating models? When is it too much versus when is the right time to bring that into effect?
Yeah, no, wonderful question. If you're a 2-person company, you need an operational framework from day one. Keep it simple. It's not about over-engineering 10 million tools. It's really about aligning. And so the way I approach it is thinking about, first, we need to understand who we are as a company, even if you're a 2-person company. And once we get that alignment as who we are, what are we trying to achieve, what is the strategy then to achieve that? And then building out milestones and thinking about what are the timelines and deliverables to achieve those milestones. Get that on paper. And then from there, just really thinking about what resources do we have available to achieve this, right? And so once we kind of think about what resources do we have, what resources do we need to get, do we make things in-house, do we outsource? And then from there, just kind of breaking down the organization into different operational functional areas, and then thinking about how we work with the team to kind of divide and conquer, have clear roles and responsibilities. So for me, that is critical, whether you're small or larger. And I think the earlier you build it into the ethos of the company, right, it just makes it easier to bring people in. I also see that with startups when you think about hiring. If, startups tend to be a big black box. And if you don't have this organization and simple systems and processes from day one, how are you expecting new people that come in to work independently if they don't know what they need to do? So it's really about a way to just get the team to work effectively together and it makes it easier to scale.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I do believe that, like I said, you don't want to over-engineer, and also you don't want to get in the way of innovation. I think that's really critical in life sciences companies, that, you don't want to put in all these processes that the scientists are just going to get frustrated and they can't focus on their work. So it's really about partnering with the R&D team and making sure that whatever systems and processes are in place is facilitating what they can do to drive innovation.
So maybe to double click on that a little bit, it sounds like, so to double click on that a little bit, even at the earliest stages, even if a company has no operational hires, it sounds like what you're saying is that they need to have an operating model in mind.
Yes.
They need to lay out the plans that they have, the resources that are required, the goals and the roadmaps and so on. And that's the foundation to get the company off the ground.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, for companies and organizations, like this, how do you, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. We can edit that out. So going back to, what you just mentioned, it sounds like, even companies at the earliest days with only 2 people need to kind of plan and roadmap out over the course of years, the activities they need to do, how long that takes, how much that costs, what resources they have at their disposal, and so on. But how do you then go from there? You mentioned something before that, operations is really important because you want to see something actually get to market.
Yes.
So, you talked about a crisis that happened that really made you have to jump on that and bring this framework to bear. But what are other things that founders and teams should be thinking about that where operations is really the unlock for their idea to get to market?
So my favorite word is execution. And I think that's going to be the key in terms of thinking about getting to market. So for what founders need to think about, it's going to be the right combination of the right people in the right role at the right time. So hiring the right people who are dedicated, have the right niche technical abilities, and really bring in key hires that are going to really round your bread and butter of what you're trying to do. Next, like I mentioned, having just a clearly defined strategy that is transparently communicated with all levels of the team. It should not just be housed in with management or executives. Like everyone on the team, good ideas come from everywhere. There needs to be full transparency. And once you have that clearly defined strategy, the right people, finally it comes down to the systems and processes, fit for use, keep it simple. And then the combination of those kind of 3 different areas is really where you are able to effectively execute and drive, and if you're effectively executing, that means you are hitting your deliverables to get to market, right? Like you've set out, these are my value creation inflection points that we've agreed upon and that we're going to, execute, whether it's on the business side or the R&D side to get there. So I think that's really critical. And I think in early stages, founders really need to put a lot of attention on the people and the culture. I think it's obviously it's critical to focus on the technology, but I think that is something that in a startup, you're so few that if you're 3, 4, 10, 15 people, if there's one person that's disconnected from the mission, it's a huge burden. So I think that's something that founders need to put a lot of effort into, and to having a positive culture, having people that are really driven. So I think that's another thing that founders really need to invest time and effort on.
So double clicking on the people part, what are some of the lessons you've learned from building teams, and particularly who are the right people at the right time for a company? And maybe thinking about even the stages that you've been through, from you've done, early stage discovery, no lab, no nothing, to clinical stage and clinical trials. So who are the right people at the right time, or how do people change and evolve as the company moves down the stages of R&D?
Yeah, absolutely. So I like to say mindset over skill set in a startup specifically. Obviously, you have to have the core technical abilities, and then there's certain roles that are highly technical, and you do need to obviously focus on that niche area. But in a startup, it's a very unique experience. So regardless if you're business or R&D, you have to mentally be okay with ambiguity. You have to be open to adaptability, being able to pivot, the unknowns.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's really critical that when you're interviewing for early stage hires, that you're thinking about soft skills, you're thinking about the mindset of the individual and if they can thrive in that sort of environment, because there's amazing technical people that struggle in a more ambiguous and also fast-paced and aggressive.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's one thing. And I also think you really have to put a lot of time and effort on mission-driven because every startup is going to go through hard times. It's a roller coaster. You have your high highs and your low lows, and you don't want people jumping ship because it's just a job. So it's really important to put a focus on people who care about what you're working on. The role is greater than just them. It's about the team and what we're trying to achieve, and being really dedicated and mission driven is important. So, of course, like I said, skill sets, you have to have like the core competencies, but then also just more so than ever to start up those kind of other areas you have to think about.
Yeah. And one of the things I'm getting from what you're describing is that there's this need to manage the tension between scientific creativity for all the things that are possible with operational rigor.
Yes.
And one of the things that we've talked about a little bit is how you can manage between those two ends of the spectrum through things like scenario planning. So maybe let's talk about that a little bit. What is scenario planning as a concept, and how have you applied that to the companies that you've worked with and helped start up?
Yeah, absolutely. So with scenario planning, it's really important because one, the market changes so fast. You kind of have to adapt and sometimes change plans. Competitors come along. There's also just a lot of external forces you can't predict, COVID, and supply chain disruptions. So I think it's really important to, as I mentioned, have a clearly defined who we are and your core milestones. Like, this is our agreed upon plan. Like, you always have to have plan A, right? But what I find is really helpful is that you work with each of your different departments and, ask them to think about what are potential risks based on your subject matter expertise that could arise in your functional area. And can this create a significant impact to the organization? And once you've identified a handful of key risks, you build scenarios around those risks, right? And so it's really important that that agreed upon plan is aggressive and, you're really pushing, but then having, scenario B where, let's say manufacturing, you can have out of spec results when you're doing an analytical testing. And now you're going to have to go back and remanufacture the drug product, or you have to try and work with your CDMO to resolve that out of spec results. Can we, reanalyze it in a different way? Can we step back? So I think it's really important to kind of know what the high likelihood issues that can arise, and then have different timelines. So, if that's identified as kind of a pretty high risk scenario, because that happens in manufacturing a lot, right? That you've already discussed that if this occurs, let's say it causes a 3-month delay and an additional, let's say, 250,000 fee to remanufacture, and that the entire executive suite is aware of that, because even though you're hoping that that doesn't happen, it's not good to blindside with scenarios. So that's really what scenario planning is about. It's thinking about risk mitigation, backup plans, and that there's transparency so that if it does arise, you've already proactively thought through the potential solutions and have really thought about how you solve it in advance.
Yeah.
So I think that's really why it's important.
Yeah. And this is really interesting because I'm in the software development world and we don't need to think about nearly as many risks. We write code and it works and we give it to our customers. So why don't we double click on the different kinds of risks that seem intrinsic to any work that you're doing in life sciences? You talked about things like manufacturing, things like competition. Like if I was a biotech founder, what are all the risks that I need to be considering at any given time that could affect my program and my pipeline?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to break this down into R&D, site, and business risks.
Okay.
So when it comes to R&D, it's really just about sometimes your technology doesn't kind of play out, you have a thesis of what's going to, hypothesis. And so just having different optionality baked into your pipeline. I do think it's really important to have your key programs, but also having different eggs in the basket and different potential programs. Also having, if you're doing like, at Mesa, we were working on a vaccine candidate, in our back pocket, thinking about backup candidates because, you're waiting for that clinical data to really show safety, efficacy, things like that. So you don't know until you get the data. So having in parallel different backup candidates, or if you're doing small molecule or whatever you're working on, just always investing time and money into your R&D program to have optionality. So you're not starting back from square one if something doesn't go as planned.
Right.
Also related to R&D, just because I live this and it's a pain point, supply chain, lab consumables. Hopefully things will have settled down now for her. But, I lived through the COVID supply chain disruption. And I remember, so my husband, he's also kind of in supply chain world. And I remember before the shelter in place happened, he was like, wow, there's less container ships coming in from China. Like, what's going on? And in my head, I was like, okay, like, what does that mean for Mesa, right? And so I actually went to our vendor and ordered a 6-month supply of lab consumables, plastics, flask, because you can't do research without pipette tips. You can't move your program forward. And we were actually still at J Labs, the incubator space at the time, and we didn't have space to store 6 months. So I hired a warehouse here in the East Bay where they do warehouse storage as well as lab moves. So I got 6 months supplies and had it there. And that's one of the reasons Mesa was able to hit our deliverables, because if I had not proactively done that, we couldn't do research. So that's just another thing when it comes to R&D, like, really understanding what resources your team needs to do the work and building in redundancies and backup plans. In terms of site and facilities, the risk associated there is you outgrow your space too fast. You don't have, the other issue is you don't have the proper infrastructure like equipment, which can be very expensive and can have long lead times if you have specialty equipment. Permitting, once you know what you're doing, it's pretty straightforward, but I think that just having someone on your team who is aware on how to run a tight ship with a facility, thinking about safety programs, so all the different policies in place, make sure your team's safe, and just all the maintenance. There's a lot of, bits and pieces that go along in the background that nobody knows about with running a site. So I think it's just really being thoughtful and purposeful, and once again, being proactive, having backup vendors. So if you have a primary janitor, but, having a backup one or recommendations or a backup HVAC vendor. So I think that's the thing, just having partners in your orbit that you can pull upon to maintain your site. And then finally, for the business side, for me, the risk is that you deviate from your mission. And I think it's really important from the top down that the executives are keeping the team really clearly aligned, that you don't spread too thin and start, this is a cool idea, this is a cool idea. I mean, we love innovation. We don't want to stop that. But things can quickly spiral out of control. You can burn through money if you're not also just really focused on the core deliverables. So I think, and then tying all of that to finance, contracts. So I think one thing that's a pain point for life science companies of all sizes, but especially for startups, how do you tie the technical data to the program planning to the financial side, right? And so, scientists, they're like, wow, we got this great data, but maybe not realizing you're going 30% over budget on one of your CRO contracts. And how does that impact the rest of your portfolio? With program planning, once again, how does individual decisions within one program, so like at Mesa, we had our primary of a pediatric RSV vaccine. We also had a SARS-CoV-2 vaccine program that was in parallel. Both were in clinical study at the same time. as well as we had a pre-IND HMPV program. And how do we shift personnel and resources to really tackle our prioritized deliverables? And that changes over time. You have your plan, but guess what? 6 months in, you have to pivot. People care less about COVID vaccines. Okay, go on this, right? So it's just really having all that data. And so I think that's on a business side, the best way to mitigate risk is to have access to real-time data across the organization that you can then make strategic decisions. Because if you don't have real-time data, when you make a decision, you don't know how that impacts, right? So I think in relation to scenario planning, to spending, to contracts, all of that, you just need to have a picture that's quick and easy without having to go to finance every time and say, hey, run this report. And then I have to go meet with a department head and be like, hey, what's the status of your contract? So just somehow
pulling it all together.
Yeah.
So these are really, really great examples. And I think we can walk through kind of each of those major categories to kind of turn this into practical advice for biotech founders. So it's hard enough to start a biotech company and manage all of the scientific probability of success or failure. But you talked about a lot of other things that can really disrupt your business, whether that's competition, the supply chain and CROs and CDMOs you're working with, the site that you even physically have. So let's kind of go through each of those examples. So starting with competition. So I'm a biotech founder. I've started a company. I have this great plan of how I'm going to bring this really interesting, differentiated new medicine to market. But I need to consider the competitive landscape. And when you worked at Mesa, you had two different, it sounds like, really huge competitive things that you had to factor in. One was something with Sanofi having a competitive vaccine program, and the other was COVID. So why don't you walk us through how competition adjusted and changed your plans as a company and how you responded to that?
Yeah, oh, definitely. So I think, as you mentioned, you need to understand your competitive landscape, and that will change over time. So I think that was really important for us, where we knew the different modalities for the different RSV vaccines that were on the market. We knew the different formats. We knew whatever data was out there that was publicly available for the different companies. Obviously, there was a handful of different big pharmas that were in the space. And then, companies give updates, right? And just being really on top of that, digging into the data that's presented and publicly available. And then how are we comparing to that data that's presented? So, and then how do we adjust our timelines to be a key player? And so Sanofi, they were also working on a pediatric RSV live attenuated viral vaccine. And so, when data came out last year, for them, it was, hey, we just did the accelerated phase 1 and 2 combined study, and now we're pushing to phase 3. And we had our clinical development plan already mapped out, when we're targeting to hit, the BLA, when we want to go to market. But then it really made us sit down and think, how can we do better, right? We created a plan that worked for us, but how do we think outside the box to bring that in? And that's all triggered by the change in the landscape. And then also just thinking about when we were planning our phase 2 clinical study, how that impacted what countries we were looking at and thinking about in terms of our clinical studies, just what based on what was publicly available. So I think it's just really important to, like I said, be very on top of your industry, on top of your indication, digging deep and analyzing the data, how you compare, how you're different, how you're better. Always believe you're better. And then from there, aligning the executive team that everybody has the same data information, challenge each department head to do an analysis for their own subject, their own area of expertise, and say, come up with potential ideas on how we can bring in the timeline or how we can change, adapt. What risk could be introduced by changing the plan, and then make a recommendation. And then get everybody in the same room. Everybody pitches that for each department, and then not leaving that room until decisions are made. And once those decisions are made, they're documented. You have it in writing on one, what everybody agreed upon, or two, if you need more information, what action items and responsible person to get that information and timelines are agreed upon. And that way you can just really effectively adapt. And, it's part of the nature of what we do. The landscape changes quickly, but I think it's just getting everybody aligned and then, boom, 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 just, execute.
How do you think about focus versus diversification? Because, you talked about how you all had a vaccine technology platform, you're going after RSV, then you hear about Sanofi, accelerating their clinical trials, then COVID comes along. And, on the one hand, you might want to put all your eggs in one basket and go after the lead program. On the other hand, you could hedge your bets, but then not advance really anything that far. So how should people be thinking about focus versus diversification when it comes to their drug development pipelines?
My answer is you need both, but in a fine balance. Because if you have a sole program that you don't have any backups and you're putting all your eggs in one basket and you don't know what data you'll get until you do it, if you get negative data, where does your company stand? You don't exist, basically, because who wants to invest in something to fund you to go back to square one? So I think you do need to have optionality, but optionality that is very strategic, where it's in the same realm, right? Like you're not doing two completely different programs that are unrelated. Like, ideally some sort of platform where, people see the value where I'm not only doing this today, but in the future, I can add a third program, a fourth program. They're all off of the same platform. I think that's really important. But picking different indications or, different targets that will really allow you to kind of play off of each other, that they're adding value to each other. But in the end, you do need to pick a key focus. Like you do need to pick a key target that you need to put a majority of your resources towards because you have limited resources in a startup typically. And if you start diversifying too far, and if you're doing 3 things at equal resources, it's gonna take you longer to develop those 3 in parallel. And it really, when you're a small startup, time to proof of concept is gonna make or break you because you need your number 1 proof of concept of your technology to then basically get the excitement around programs 2 and 3. So I think it's really important to have other options in the background that are related and foster the platform. But I think ideally you do have to have very defined number 1 and how much percentage of resources you want to allocate to each program. So maybe you're doing 50 or 70% towards program number 1. And then in the back end, you are advancing your other programs, but maybe not to the same aggressive level. So you have those optionality if things don't go as planned. But I also think the important thing to realize, don't try and pitch yourself too strong as a platform from day one. In the sense that if your lead program fails, it's going to be very difficult to then go like, well, our best option didn't work, but option number 2 and 3 are wonderful. Like, it's just a harder story to sell. So I think it's just like, that's why you want to put more emphasis on where you feel like you're going to have the greatest impact.
So let's talk about another kind of risk that you dove into, which is around, supply chain, the CROs and CDMOs you're using. Let's zoom out from that. First, there's a big trend of people starting what are called virtual biotechs, where they externalize almost all of the work. I'm curious for your take on virtual biotechs, externalizing everything to CROs and CDMOs versus doing some of or all of the work in-house.
I'm a big supporter because I do think, especially in a small biotech company, you want to focus on your bread and butter of what you do best. It is rare in a small team that you're going to have somebody who's amazing at discovery R&D and be like, oh yeah, I know how to do GMP manufacturing as well. So I think the amount of capital investment that would be required to do that in-house is so much, and you haven't hit proof of concept yet. So you can go into trying to build out all these capabilities, getting all this equipment in-house, hiring the team to do all this work, only to find out, hey, looking at our data, we're going to have to pivot and go something different. So I think I really love the virtual model. I mean, it's a balance. I also am a big believer in having some research capabilities in-house because you want to do feasibility testing and you want to be able to support the CDMOs and the CROs because you've done your own in-house testing. And that way you can provide them protocols, right? Like, oh, well, we've done an initial pilot test in-house at a small scale, and now we're going to tech transfer this out to a CRO. So I think that's really important.
And maybe double clicking on that. So it sounds like there are a lot of advantages to using CROs and CDMOs, particularly for capabilities that you don't have in-house. But then I've heard, other folks complain about the opaqueness. They don't know what they're doing. Is it actually going to happen when you expect it to? And maybe more trouble than it's worth. So what have you done to help manage this successfully versus what have you learned as potential pitfalls?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So this is actually, I love this area. Actually, I love to talk about this. So I'm big on building partnerships and relationships. I think a lot of times people hire outsourced partners and it's transactional. And that's where the ambiguity comes in. You're not getting the deliverables you want. They're not adhering to timelines, budget's getting out of scope. But when you have your day one conversations, it's really about finding somebody where this is a mutually beneficial relationship. Like they want to help you with advancing your program and you want to help them, in building their business. So I think, putting effort in doing like requests for proposals to multiple partners, doing so in a way that's systematic, where you have, a proposal plan that companies are responding to. So you're getting the same data from 3, 4, 5 different CROs, and then you can cross compare and then dig in. I think that's really helpful for really large scale projects, especially.
Like a bake-off, basically.
Yes, a bake.
Yeah.
No, but we didn't always do that from day one in the really early stuff. Like in the early days, you kind of leverage who you know. But definitely as we advance and we're preparing for our phase 2 clinical study, we were outsourcing our clinical assays. So we had to find a partner that can do all the various clinical testing for our phase 2. We also had to find a CDMO to manufacture our drug substance, drug product, and do all the analytical testing for release. And it was a game changer for us to do a request for proposal and then building relationships. So you'll see in your responses that you get. So some partners have a very it looks like they just spit out an algorithm and there was no thought.
Yeah.
And that's a warning sign. There's partners who will, CROs that put together a really thoughtful proposal and they go above and beyond. It's also about who you're working with on the business development team. And I have to say the partners we ended up picking, they're amazing partners. I highly, whenever people ask, I always highly recommend them because they really cared about our program. So I think that's where it's critical. You need to put the time and effort in prior to signing a contract to find the right partner, not just, oh, can I do this? And making it clear. I think the other thing is, I did this even with supply chain stuff, like when I work with vendors, communicate the urgency and what this means for your company. And I would say that, especially during COVID times, and if I needed either research that was being outsourced, or I'm like, if I don't get this data, we won't have any time for the board. And that will impact our company. Or if I don't get this by X date, and it was never negative. It was never like an upset thing, but it was once again building that mutual relationship where we're getting them equally excited about our program and then just being clearly transparent. Like, this is what we expect. So they're a service provider, right? And yes, they're going to do their proposals, but you need to, whatever you end up crafting in your contract, you need to ensure it aligns with your internal needs.
Yep.
And if it's not aligning, then it's not going to work out. And it's just fully transparent.
Yep.
And also contracts, dig in deep and negotiate, because a lot of the CROs, CDMOs, they are heavily biased to help themselves. And trust me, I mean, I've done hundreds of contracts now, at Mesa, had an amazing legal support team, and we were able to really craft some contracts that were favorable for us as an organization because, things don't always go to plan. And you need to ensure that that's another risk mitigation consideration that, don't just take the CRO's contract and sign it. Invest the time and money with a lawyer, not just, a scientist, to craft a mutually beneficial contract because that's protecting the business.
So it sounds like if you are to externalize a lot of work, you're trading one kind of complexity for another. So one kind of complexity is hiring people with the requisite skill sets, building the facilities, and so on. But if you're externalizing a lot of the work, walk us through the end-to-end kind of cast of characters, and also how do you operationalize that? Because it sounds like it's anything from legal to reaching out to vendors to your subject matter experts internally. But then there's also managing work that you yourselves are not doing or you are doing in partnership with somebody else. So what does it look like? Kind of what's mission control for getting these contracts in the first place and managing delivery when most of the delivery is happening with external parties outside your control?
Yeah. And I'm going to give a little context here, like with Mesa. So at any given time, we were 15 to 25 full-time employees. We did leverage a lot of outsourced partners, whether they were consultants, service providers, vendors. And we were actively doing multiple phase 1 clinical studies in parallel, multiple discovery R&D in-house, and multiple ongoing manufacturing programs. So it's a very small team and we accomplished a lot. So I just want to give that for context. So for managing that, you need to have a technical expert managing those contracts. Like if you are outsourcing research, you should have some technical know-how. And so, we had amazing scientists who had done the work themselves, whether at Mesa or at other organizations. And that's how you can dig in and ask the deep questions. If you're outsourcing research, ask for the protocols that they develop, QC them, right? Ask to review the batch record, right? Dig into the data yourself. So I think that's the thing. The reality is a lot of people think, like I said, it's transactional. You say, I'm hiring you to do this, you do it and you give it back to me. But it needs to be a high touch point. You need to work with their program managers. You need to work with their scientists. You need a QC and it's your baby, right? So you need to take ownership of really digging in deep if you're externalizing. Which means that your internal team needs to have some level of, technical, know-how. And so, and then in terms of thinking about different service partners, so I oversaw all things operations and, obviously I have a technical background and my focus is operations, but I oversaw IT. I oversaw finance. I oversaw legal and HR. I'm not expert in any of those, but I hired amazing external partners that I then work with and manage and communicated the company's needs and my expectations of what I expect from them to then manage those external partners. So they can only do what they're best based on the information you give them. So it needs to be a two-way street and there needs to be a lot of communication about what they're giving you, feedback that you're giving them, and just clear, defined roles and responsibilities and what you need from them and who's going to do what. Because, I just high touch point.
Yeah. So one more question on this topic, and then we'll move on to the next one is, you talked about how while you were working at Mesa, you both had clinical stage programs as well as programs in the earlier kind of research and development phase. And I'm wondering, if I was a biotech founder and, clinical trials seem way off, they're going to be years and years away. I'm at the discovery stage or I have some leads or something like that. When should I start thinking about preparing for clinical trials? And when should I start engaging with potential, CROs and CDMOs who would help me with that? When is way too early versus when is proactive to be thinking about my clinical development plan?
I think it should be built in early because the way you design your product will impact the target profile, right? And the clinical development plan. So I think it's important. I wouldn't necessarily engage with CROs and CDMOs from day one, but I would engage with regulatory and medical consultants or advisors because they're going to have the know-how and expertise to help you guide what expectations are going to be needed for clinical development. And based on those expectations, you're going to have to potentially adjust even your product, right? And your technology. Because I think one thing, so we were a live attenuated viral vaccine. It was an RSV-based backbone. And it was a fully wild type RSV, but there was codon deoptimization. So there was a lot of mutations in the different key genes that made it attenuated. And so, they had this amazing viral product, but it's more than just that. It's the formulation. And it's the device. How are you delivering it? And then in terms of the device, how is the clinician using it? What are they comfortable using in this clinic? So, I have had so many conversations about syringes. I know more than I would ever expect. And even in the clinic about the assays and the clinical testing, I know way more about swabs than I would ever think to know, because there's all these other aspects that will actually impact your technology and your product that are related to the clinical development plan. And you need to get those answers early, because even like for us, it was like the volume that we were delivering. It was an intranasal vaccine. And depending on the age of the recipients and depending on what devices were available, there's just so many layers. And even thinking about the regulatory considerations of those devices, some were improved in some countries and not others. It's just so complex that you need to have that conversation day one. But I would say not with the CROs and CDMOs, because they just care about executing. But really the strategic advisory conversations from, so we had acting chief medical officer consultant and acting vice president of regulatory affairs that were involved very early, even before I joined. So I think, and that was all pre-Series A.
Yeah, that's great. So maybe another risk that you talked about that sounds like people don't really think about on a day-to-day basis is facilities and sites. And, let's say I'm a biotech founder, I get in some really cool incubator and I'm expanding my team. How should I be thinking about, finding new space? Do I go get a real estate broker? Do I go to another incubator? Do I do a turnkey thing? How should I even be thinking about that process? And, how easy or difficult is it to go find a lab space as you scale your company?
Yeah, it depends on the market. Depending on the year, there's either a lot of space available or it's very difficult to find. Long story short, 6 to 12 months in advance, which surprises people. I don't know how many conversations people are like, oh, we're looking to move in 2 months. It is feasible, but the reality is to find a space that combines all the necessary needs of your organization, the right location for your employees, the right size, the right cost, the right technical capabilities. It's kind of like all of these things coming together that it's not always available on the market when you need it. So I think it's really important to start early. Partner with an amazing commercial real estate broker. I mean, personally, I have some amazing friends in that space, and they are just amazing resources. And when I joined Mesa, that was my number one thing that they were like, we need to move out of JLabs, right? And so day one, met with a commercial real estate broker, and I told him, show me everything that's currently on the market. Like, not just only things you think, but I was like, everything from San Francisco to Santa Clara, give me a tour, get that data, figure out what's best for your team. It's going to take a while. And also sometimes you'll find spaces that need to be built out. Maybe they aren't perfect. They need to be modified. So you have to build in that time for general contractors, architects, engineering. And then obviously be open-minded. So yes, there's a lot of different models now. So there's incubators, and there's different types of incubators have different capabilities. Some are really geared towards 2-3 person. Some incubators can accommodate larger teams. It also depends what equipment they have. Does it align with what your team needs? Some incubators have more equipment than others. And then, there's sublease options. So especially in this market, there's a lot of sublease opportunities. So that could be a good interim step if you're not sure if you're ready to go into your own independent space. The main risk with that is you're beholden to the primary lease holder. So if their plans change, then yours will have to change as well. So I think that's one risk, but it might be a risk worth taking to have an interim solution, because the reality is moving into your own independent space. It's a huge commitment. I mean, you're lucky if you get a 5-year lease. Like usually it's more industry standard to see 7-year lease terms.
Oh, wow.
Well, for life sciences, at least here in the Bay Area. I mean, there's different options. Like in Ultravax, we had a month-to-month lease, which is very unusual.
Yeah.
But if you're thinking about traditional spaces, whether in the Peninsula or the East Bay, a lot of time it's a multi-year lease term, which means you have to have the proper financing and runway to do that. So I think obviously if you don't have that kind of runway, then having to consider other options like incubators or subleases. So there's just a lot that goes into it. But it's really about the only way it's going to work is get out there and just start looking even before you think you're ready, because you need to be informed. And the more spaces that you look at, the more you narrow down what your true needs are as an organization, because you think you know what you need, but then you go out and you physically see it. And then there's things you don't think about, like property management. Like we had one space that was amazing, the space itself, but it was just an individual landlord. There was no amenities, there was no property management, there was no support. Versus where we ended up at, it was an amazing space, but it had on-site property management, and there was a gym that was free to employees. There was an amazing space. They had maintenance on call 24/7, so if something was broken. So there's a lot of like accessory considerations that, or even actually things which to look out for risk. Does it have a loading dock? Does it have an elevator that can fit your equipment? I don't know the number of elevators, so I carry my measuring tape and I'm taking the dimensions, because if they don't have a freight elevator, how do you get your 6-foot biosafety cabinet up into your lab?
Right.
How do you get your -80 freezer into the lab? Do you need plumbing for a dishwasher, or do you need an autoclave, right? So there's a lot of space considerations in terms of infrastructure, and also every single lab build out I've seen, the engineers and architects never build in enough electrical. So yeah, it's just, I mean, I can go on and on. There's just HVAC, mechanical plans, electrical. It's a lot. So, but guess what? If you find a life science commercial real estate broker, they've lived this and they can walk you through it.
That's great. So maybe shifting to another topic, there's a lot of complexity that you've talked about managing, the long-term and long-range plan for the company, the R&D operations, both across internal teams and external CROs and CDMOs, and then also trying to account for all these different scenarios of things that could impact the business. So I'm curious, what are some of the systems or tools or frameworks you've used to help manage this complexity?
I'm going to preface this by saying that I've done a lot of manual stuff, which is painful and maybe not necessarily recommended, but definitely what I've used. So, in terms of like, let's start with processes. I think one, just having a communication cadence with the team defined, when, what type of meetings you're going to have, what's the purpose of those meetings, how things are being documented. Are you having program planning meetings? So you do have to have like a cadence and communication interaction before you even think about tools. And then in terms of tools, like I said, I was doing pretty manual Excel spreadsheets. Painful. One, to create
What are you
them.
building into those?
Yeah, I just, it was, you kind of get stuck into sometimes using what you know, and you're moving fast. Smart sheets, PowerPoint to make Gantt and, track summaries and create overall. And so it worked. That being said, it was quite painful for me because it was really difficult to track changes. So sure, I can create a database of, okay, these are all the ongoing programs, these are the contracts, these are the forecasting, these are the dollar amounts we expect. And, here's a PowerPoint slide summarizing, And then, oh, here's a smart sheet where it goes into the weeds of the actual deliverables and the interdependencies. And great, they're all different systems. They're not speaking to each other. Okay, I get a phone call saying, hey, actually, we're thinking about doing this instead. And I need it by tomorrow. And that's where it really kind of fell apart.
Who's on the phone?
Top level executive. Something coming from the board, CEO. And so, which, it's great that I had this data, but the issue with that is it was so manual. So I'd open up my Excel spreadsheet where I'd maintain my database of my programs and my contracts, have to make changes, but they're all manual formulas and making sure they're validated and you're not making calculation errors. And then having to kind of manually update. Do I need to reach out to accounting, say, hey, can you give me an update on this contract? So it's just very like having to go out to different resources. But I mean, it worked for us because it was very visual and it was, but like I said, it was painful. But then I'd be like, oh, okay, now I got to go manually update my PowerPoint and I got to shift the bar this way. And all the formatting and editing, which is, just to make it look pretty, but is time consuming. And then once again, just then updating the Smartsheet. So, those are kind of what we did. It worked for us at the time, but it was also a huge time sink for myself personally. And also a little nerve wracking, just double checking, triple checking to make sure everything was aligned across the various different systems, which was the other issue. Like, well, I updated my Excel spreadsheet, but now Smartsheets and PowerPoint weren't updated. So that was...
And I imagine this might create challenges when you talk a lot about culture and keeping the company aligned as like, how do you empower people with information to autonomously come up with the right answers rather than having to rely on you for the state of the world? So I'm curious about where you find yourself being the bottleneck and how you kind of empower other people so that you're not the bottleneck or the holder of this information.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the things I love and also is a little bit of a pain point about operations is I have a bird's eye view, but I also am deep in the weeds and I love being able to have insights into all departments, which is great. But once again, like you said, it's a bottleneck and it's difficult if everybody's already coming to you. So I think in terms of transparency, for us, what worked really well was we had a smart sheet that was accessible to by all the department heads and all the key personnel. They were technically responsible to going and making updates if things have changed since our last meeting. But the reality was, too, that it wasn't always getting updated. So to maintain accountability of the team, we had bi-monthly program planning meetings where we went into the weeds. It wasn't explaining all the details and why I did this, but it was just data reporting. So basically, we would pull up the smart sheet and each department would just be like, no change, no change, no change. Oh, wait, this is brought in a day. This is brought out a week or... So we would update in real time together in addition to what they were supposed to do on their own. But that was a great way just to hold people accountable, that they're actually, staying on top of that. And then at the programming session, I had an amazing operations manager who worked with me and she would just record everything. So every single meeting, a long Word document that was a summary of all the updates that were communicated, any changes and any risk, and then call to action. So I think that's just really important. And those were available to all executive team members and all department heads in shared drives. So that way, if anybody missed a meeting, they can go back and see what was discussed. And it's also great because if decisions are made and like, hey, how did this happen? It's like, well, so I think just really documenting that and accountability. And then in terms of then kind of tying it to, we had quarterly board meetings and that's kind of really was when I would go in and update the forecast database that was then provided to the finance team to then work their magic and actual real spreadsheets. But, just keeping that updated as well. And,
So maybe walk us through one kind of just high-level step-by-step example is like some, external event comes in, maybe you want to, hit a clinical trial by a certain time. Then you need to, do what with who in order to get the information necessary to evaluate an approach and then stay in that room until you get to a decision. Just walk us through, just so that people might understand, how do I approach a new event happens,
Mm-hmm.
it's going to change or alter my company's program plans.
Mm-hmm.
How do I step by step go from that kind of input to ultimately making a decision?
Yeah, no, I think a great example was probably in 2022, we had got back our data on our 10 to the 6 viral titer of our RSV vaccine and our target indication in our pediatric population. We had great data, but we were like, can we push the bar a bit further, right? And so we had a call to action to the team is, can we manufacture a 10 to the 7th viral titer, which had never been delivered actually in a clinic before. 10 to the 6 was the highest. So we were kind of pushing the boundaries of the industry. One, could we manufacture it? And two, could we get it into the clinic before the RSV season? Because when you're doing clinical trials, I mean, it depends what you're doing, but for us, like the RSV season impacted when we could actually do our study. And so basically, call to action, can we do this? So first things first, who's the first bottleneck? The first bottleneck is manufacturing. So everybody's in a call having the same conversation and then just working through the technical details of, can we even feasibly do this? Can we leverage material that we have? So just kind of digging deep into bottleneck number one. Once that's been identified of, yes, we can manufacture the 10 to the 7th drug product. From there, what about the clinical considerations? What are the regulatory timelines? Do we make an amendment to our existing protocol? Does our clinical site have the capacity to take this in? And if we do start dosing by X date, how fast do we have to enroll to be able to beat the RSV season? So once again, the process is, call to action, a very clearly defined deliverable that we want to manufacture this product by this date to get into clinic by this time. And once you have that defined, then each of the departments just diving into their subject matter area to really understand what they can and can't do. Because if the clinical side is like, oh yeah, our partner's on board, our clinical site can do it and they can enroll, great. But if we can't manufacture in time and get analytical testing and release the drug product, then it doesn't matter what the clinical can and can't do. So it's really about each department doing a deep dive, what is feasible, and then getting together with all department heads and saying, this is what I can offer, this is what I can offer, and then do these pieces align? Can we then bring it together? And then there were sometimes we had such aggressive timelines that 1 day difference could change the path of our program. So then just very high touch point, making sure people are providing real-time updates if anything pivots from the agreed upon plan. Yeah. So it's just really looking at that target plan and mapping it in real time.
Yeah. So this has been a really great and really rich interview in terms of advice and learnings. Why don't we close it out with a few rapid fire questions? So the first is, what is a piece of advice that someone has given you at some point and you wish you heard earlier in your career?
Okay. So I actually, fortunately, heard this pretty early in my career. One of my most amazing mentors who I worked with at the original Maxogen as well as Ultravax, so Sean Du, he was our COO of our company at Ultravax. And he went on to move on to an amazing opportunity actually at Sanofi. And I remember sitting in his office across from him and, he gave me advice because there's a lot of responsibilities that I would have to take over. And I looked at him and was like, I can't do what you do. And his immediate response was, why not? No hesitation, just you can do it. And I think that advice of just that confidence that you have the ability, just nobody's questioning you, that people have full faith in you. I also think the other advice that came out of that conversation was you were going to be imperfect from day one. When I was looking at his career and he was this amazing scientist, amazing business professional, but that was after years of developing versus he's like, well, what do you think I was like on day one? And so I think that is just removing that barrier expecting perfection in your career, that my favorite saying is start somewhere, because the reality is people get so stuck in their head that I have to know all the details. I have to be trained in this. I have to have done this before. But the reality is you can't get to that point until you challenge yourself and do it for the first time. So you just have to start somewhere, be okay with imperfection. But whenever things don't go the way you expect them to, that you need to be like, why did that not work? And how do I make sure that doesn't happen again? So you just need to be very honest with yourself and not take it personal when things don't go as planned. You need to learn their learning experiences. I think I was fortunate I had that advice early in my career, but I really hope others, think about that.
Yeah, absolutely. How do you see portfolio management operations evolving in the next decade?
Yeah. So I think for myself, one thing I'm getting really excited about is this, obviously we have incubators, but now you're seeing venture studios. In terms of operations, I think is really critical because, I think a lot of historical approaches was, you're in an incubator, you move out in your own facility, then get proof of concept. But you're spending a lot of money on infrastructure, and operationally it takes a lot to manage that. So I think I'm really excited about these venture studios, whether it's a VC ran or like an independent company that's kind of running a think tank, and then leveraging shared operations, but taking it a step beyond an incubator. Because usually incubators, it's like there's certain shared infrastructure, but there's a lot of stuff that the individual companies still have to manage on their own. Finance, program management, permitting, waste. And so, you're still responsible for doing that versus in more of a venture studio, you have an in-house operating partner that's supporting multiple companies. So I think for me, that's really exciting because allowing these companies get to proof of concept in a shared space, but also sharing shared knowledge in the back-end operations, which is a little bit different than kind of what you see in a traditional incubator. So I think that's really exciting because I think it's going to be able to, especially we're in a market where it's lean operations, right? Like everybody's feeling the impact of that. And I think it is great long-term because people can extend their money to focus on the science. So I'm really excited to see that further developed.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, Janelle.
Yeah, thank you, Ashoka. Always a pleasure.